Hi, everyone. I'm Rafaela. I'm a producer and a host here at the Free Press, and I'm here with Negar Mojtahedi, who is a journalist with Iran International and the host of a great podcast, Eye for Iran. Negar, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Rafaela.
This week is the perfect time to have you. You're here for UNGA, the UN General Assembly, and obviously Iran has been top of mind, which is your area of topical expertise. Trump got on stage. This was one of the biggest events, of course, of the week. And here are some of the things that he said. The world's number one sponsor of terror can never be allowed to possess the most dangerous weapon. Of course, he's referring to Iran. He spoke about Operation Midnight Hammer when 7 American B-2 bombers dropped 14 of the heaviest bombs on key Iranian nuclear sites. And he said, with Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity demolished, I brokered a deal. And he goes on and on and on. What did you make of his speech, and what are some of your initial reactions?
Well, I was just waiting for him to talk about Iran. As you know, he started off with, making fun of the United Nations, the fact that the prompter went down, the whole escalator fiasco, et cetera, and then boom, there came that Iran moment where it was very strong, and he took a very hard line. But at the same time, I thought about it, and I said, he's not being forward facing. He's not talking about how he's going to deal with this. He's basically running a victory lap, and he's essentially saying the problem has been solved. And in some ways, it shows that maybe he might be indifferent now towards Iran, that, they dealt with it and it's capiche now, right? So that part, I think that that's something that the Iranians would want from the government's perspective, because they would want the U.S. to think that everything's, some sort of done deal and that they are victorious, so that meanwhile they can work on their things in the background if it becomes, I guess, deprioritized essentially. So I took it as him basically taking a victory lap here.
Well, it's the perfect transition to talk about what actually happened after the 12-day war. So just to get listeners up to speed, back in June, Israel attacked Iran, killing about 30 commanders, 11 nuclear scientists. It was an operation that seemed sort of out of a movie in some ways. Then the US, in collaboration with Israel, to much of the world's surprise, got involved when they struck at 3 nuclear sites, Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo. And related to the point you just made, immediately after, Trump said the enrichment facilities were completely and totally obliterated. Of course, he says this immediately after the strikes. There was really no time for battle damage assessments. So it obviously naturally rose eyebrows. And now we're hearing sort of the same tune to what you're saying, which is case closed. 3 months on from your reporting and from, speaking with different experts, what do we actually know about the damage that was done to the nuclear sites during the 12-day war?
Well, in some ways, it was a success. And I think that the important thing is that it wasn't a complete success in the sense that this is a closed book now, that this chapter is over. It's not. I mean, they did a big blow, both the Israelis and the Americans, to not only the Iranian nuclear capabilities, but also, the knowledge that went with a lot of these scientists, right? But the thing is that there's still 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium at 60% that's unaccounted for. Now, the Iranians recently said something that, it's buried underground, we know where it is. I have no way of knowing that without inspectors on the ground verifying such claims, right?
Yeah.
But, I recently, a couple of months ago, spoke with Oli Hainonim. He's a brilliant scientist. He was on my podcast, Eye for Iran, and he was a former Deputy Director General of the IAEA. And he said it was a success, but with the caveat that we still have this missing uranium or unaccounted for uranium. And he mentioned that with that amount of uranium at 60% purity, all you need is not a large facility. You can do it in a small facility. And you would need maybe 10 centrifuges, and you would be able to produce weapons-grade material within a matter of days. Now, I say weapons-grade material doesn't mean that you're going to be able to weaponize in a couple of days, but you are able to start your program again. And the current IAEA director has said basically along the same lines that they can rebuild and that they have the intention, most likely, of rebuilding.
And just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, this unaccounted for uranium, it's at 60%.
Purity, yes.
The weapons grade level is 90%.
That's correct.
So it's only a 30% jump. And what this expert's told you that could happen in potentially...
In a matter of days to get to that, the weapons grade material. Again, doesn't mean you're going to produce the nuclear bomb in a matter of days.
Right.
And
it's basically one component.
Exactly. It's the first step, right?
It's a massive risk. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Which means that, you're not out of the woods yet. This isn't mission accomplished, so to speak. But I feel like from what I'm seeing this week and since the 12-day war, that the Americans are kind of taking this approach like mission accomplished. But the Iranians themselves, it's kind of ironic. They've made the point that their spokesperson for the foreign minister, Esmail Baghaei, said basically along the lines of, well, if it's mission accomplished, why are you making such a big deal about this, enrichment point for negotiations if everything's been done, which is, humorous when you think about it. But he speaks to something that is true in that sense.
And the follow-on fear, if I'm understanding correctly, is that this unaccounted for uranium could potentially be used to sprint to make a nuclear weapon as a deterrent for a second wave of Israeli attacks or potentially U.S. attacks. I mean, it's all speculative. But what do you make of that concern?
The thing is that the attacks did set back Iran's nuclear ambitions. Now, how long? Most experts, I believe the Pentagon is saying it's 1 to 2 years. I recently spoke just the other day, actually, with the UN Israeli ambassador, Danny Danon, who kept describing it as years. So, the threat is gone for now, years. And I said, well, what do you mean by years? 1 year, 2 year, 5 years? That could mean anything. And he wouldn't specify because I said, well, what is your intelligence on that? There are other sources that say 6 months. So we really don't know, but it did definitely set back Iran's nuclear program, but that doesn't mean that it's over and done and dead. But they definitely did do damage and made it a lot harder for them. So in some ways, it's been, I guess, pushed over for a little bit more time or stalled in that sense. But that doesn't mean that it's over. Now, could it be used as a deterrent? I mean, there are two schools of thought to Iran's nuclear program. A lot of experts that I've spoken to said Iran was not racing for the nuclear bomb. And then they would bring up examples like India and Pakistan and how they went about their enrichment, how they went about, one day you just found out, oh, well, they've got a bomb. There wasn't all these steps that of inspections and finding out about this facility, et cetera, et cetera. It just happened. And if Iran wanted to, they would have just gone for the bomb. Now, that's just one school of thought. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with that. And that the reason, well, then some people would say, well, then why would you go to 60%? Purity. You don't need that, for example. You can have it at 3.67% for civilian use, right? And some people would say, well, they wanted to go far, but not far enough to trigger something. And so that it would act as some sort of deterrent. But then that strategy obviously failed, or else we wouldn't have seen the 12-day war in the first place if it was really such a deterrent. So now some people are saying that, in fact, this may lead to more confrontation. There are other schools of thought that say that now they have a reason to actually want the nuclear bomb.
Right.
The question is, can they, and are they in the position to do such a thing? A lot of people think of Iran as some sort of ideological regime, and I'm not saying they're not, they are, but a lot of them are very pragmatic, and a lot of them just care about their own surviving. Like, they just want the regime itself to survive, and they'll do anything at any cost to make that happen because they care about being in power. They don't care about, Islam and God and the prophet or something. Right. They may say that on stage to their audience or to their base, whoever they happen to be. But at the end of the day, the one thing I am certain of is that they want to stay in power. So is Iran on some sort of suicide mission? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that they will do anything to stay in power. I don't think that they're willing to die for some sort of ideological cause. I think that's
self-preservation.
Yeah.
You think more so? And interestingly, at the UN this week, the Iranian president said, oh, no, we've never wanted a nuclear bomb. It's not in our interest. And to follow on that logic, what I think I'm hearing is, well, the 60% is a deterrent, but we don't actually want the bomb. And then the Americans hear, well, why go to 60% if you don't want the bomb? And then it's just this
could be interpreted anyway, really.
Gridlock.
Yeah. But, at the end of the day, then somebody would say, well, why did they have secret facilities? Why did they have Fordo and things like that?
So
that were
deep underground
right.
to deter from B-2 bombing, essentially, is what that was built for.
Yeah. Well, then why do that, right? So.
Right. Well, this sort of perfectly transitions us into the question about the IAEA, which is the world's nuclear watchdog. And the reason that they've been so top of mind for people is because we don't really know, right, where this unaccounted for uranium is, what the actual state of the nuclear program is, what the damage has been done. And that's in part because people aren't on the ground doing inspections.
Exactly.
And so in July, Tehran suspended cooperation with the IAEA. About 2 weeks ago, they agreed in principle to resume inspections. So far, it's been hypothetical. To my understanding, no one has been let in to follow through on that.
Yeah, there are some reports I was seeing on social media. I don't know if it's confirmed,
right.
That they may be allowing some inspectors at some sites. Don't know if it's the damaged sites or other facilities. Again, nothing confirmed at this point, at least.
Right.
But they may be trying to dangle something with the snapbacks.
But what I'm getting at with all of this is there's a lot of back and forth.
Yes.
They don't want it. Now maybe they'll let it in.
Oh, and don't forget that there was a threat to try and kill the IAEA director, Rafael Grossi. Meanwhile, they're shaking hands and negotiating.
And it's smiling. It was in the reporting. I thought it was kind of an interesting detail that they were smiling. Anyway, what does this back and forth tell us about Iran's intentions here?
I think that it tells us something about their state of mind, and that is to stall and to buy time. Because why not? That would be in their benefit. For people who are in the Iranian regime, they just want to stall as much as they can because it's within their interest to do so.
And the confusion, the back and forth buys them time, essentially.
Of course, that as well.
So based on what you just brought up.
They themselves would say, well, that it's part of the negotiating process. But I don't know. I can't speak on their behalf, but that's one way that you can interpret it.
Because of their non-cooperation over letting inspectors in, the E3, which are three, for listeners, 3 European countries, France, Germany, and UK, have moved to reimpose sanctions on Iran that were lifted with the 2015 nuclear deal. You'll correct me if my characterization is off at any point.
No, that's correct.
One interesting thing for our American audience is I think a lot of Americans think of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, as having been a bilateral deal between the US and Iran. It wasn't.
No.
There was other players.
Russia was involved too.
Russia, China, France, Germany, UK, as we mentioned.
It was huge.
Yeah. And so the US obviously pulled out in 2018. Trump pursues maximum pressure strategy. But these other signatories want Iran to uphold their side of this agreement.
Because they're still part of it. Yeah, they're still signatories to it.
Because they're signatories. And so basically, these 3 European countries have triggered a 30-day window to reinstate sanctions, which is called the Snapback mechanism. Can you explain this a little bit more for our listeners and where things currently stand?
So it's funny, snapback is actually not mentioned at all in the JCPOA, like that actual term or that word snapback.
Yeah.
So this comes from UN Resolution 2231. And ironically, it was actually brought on by the Russians. And now they want to use their veto power, which is not going to work, et cetera, et cetera. But this would essentially reimpose UN sanctions that were placed on Iran before the 2015 JCPOA Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah.
So if that happens, it's a card that it is happening, but I mean, it looks like it is going to be enacted and follow through. Then this is a card that the Europeans have in place for when the Iranians are not participating in their view, and that's something that obviously the Americans let go of when they came out of the JCPOA, although they were able to ask one of the E3 members to do so as well. So that's essentially what the snapback is, which is what's happening right now.
And the sanctions would be things like arms embargo, ban on uranium enrichment and reprocessing, ban on launches and other activities with ballistic missile capabilities. And the biggest one, obviously, is freezing assets. If these were to go through, what would this look like for Iran? I mean, they've been living with sanctions from the U.S. strategy. Europe has been sort of in a different category. How will this impact people? No, not the government but necessarily, but just normal Iranians.
Well, unfortunately, normal Iranians will always suffer under this government, under this regime. And when it comes to sanctions, the Iranian government knows they're experts on sanctions evasions, whether it comes to, the black market, dealing with China, dealing with Russia. And in many ways, it has actually strengthened Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, because then things get kind of pushed away from what's in public view from the government, and will go to the IRGC so that they deal with it, almost like kind of like this mafia-like network. And they're able to get things inside the country, through their ports and through illegal means. And as we know that they're dealing, obviously, and exporting oil, et cetera, to China. In some ways, it actually might even make them closer. But right now, a lot of heads of state are quite fearful, it appears, of Trump and of secondary sanctions that he's promised to bring into place for players that end up negotiating or dealing with Iran in such a way. But as I said, the Iran government is experts at evading sanctions. But in the end, unfortunately, people suffer. And, it's interesting. I remember the first time around under Obama, when there was a JCPOA, people in Iran were actually quite happy. And they were looking forward to sanctions reliefs and to have, investments in the country. Because as you said, it wasn't just a bilateral agreement between the US and Iran. There are other countries involved. So you had the French, you had the Germans investing. So people didn't necessarily have to work for, government entities. They could work for, foreign investment, et cetera, and things like that. They were in the country and they had more money in the bank, and life was better for them in the sense, economically speaking. The repression has always been there. That's not something that has ever gone away. Right. But now, when just anecdotally speaking to people in Iran, and obviously we can't speak on behalf of 90 million people, but in general, what we're hearing is now they're like, you know what, we don't want an Iran nuclear deal because they just really don't trust their government. And they feel that if there is money coming in from sanctions relief, that maybe that wouldn't go to the people of Iran, that it would go to their proxies, that it would go to a nuclear program or missiles, et cetera. There's one popular slogan that a lot of Iranian protesters use, and they say, Na Gaza, na Lebanon, janam fadai Iran, which means no Gaza, no Lebanon. My life is for Iran, essentially. And that's no disrespect or anything to the Lebanese or to Palestinians in any way. Right. It just means that they don't want their money and their assets to go to
the Iranian proxies.
To their proxies. And it's not even going to the people of Lebanon or to Palestinian people, going to the proxies that are also suppressing them as well. Right. So that's kind of the overall mood or feeling with a lot of Iranian peoples, because they don't trust their government. And also, I should mention, things have changed since 2022, since the Women Life Freedom Movement, since the in-custody death. And we just had the 3-year anniversary of the killing of Mahsa Jina Amini, who was an Iranian Kurdish woman who was killed under police custody for allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. She was wearing a hijab, but not in the way that they wanted her to. Right. And since then, I know personally a lot of people who believed in reform who said, you know what, reform is dead.
Do you think that's the case?
I think that for a lot of people, they just don't believe that reform is possible.
That there'll be any progress on human rights with this government.
No way, especially when you have a constitution that is basically invoking gender apartheid and religious apartheid. For example, somebody who comes from the minority faith of the Baha'is, they can't even go to university. I know someone, I was like, he lives in New York. I said, why did you leave Iran? He goes, well, I was 18, I was Baha'i, I couldn't go to university. So I needed a future for myself. Right. So that's another thing to take into consideration as well.
One more beat on the snapback mechanism and the potential sanctions. Basically, the E3 countries are calling for a few things. They want inspectors to be allowed into Iran. We spoke about this, for Iran to disclose the holding of this 800 plus pounds of uranium, and for Iran to begin serious talks with the US. Do you think the potential for sanctions from these European countries is enough to accomplish any of those things on the list?
That's a really good question. And it all goes back to, is Iran or the Islamic Republic on a suicide mission, or do they want to stay in power? Because at one point, they're going to have to make a decision.
What do you think?
I really don't know. I really don't think that they're on a suicide mission, because if one of the outcomes of the 12-day war really showed that militarily speaking and in terms of intelligence and technology, Israel is far superior to Iran. I mean, look at the level of infiltration that they were able to do what they do. Right. And can you imagine if you're an Iranian official or a nuclear scientist or something, with the way that somebody's sleeping in their bed and suddenly a bomb goes off and they're dead? I would be paranoid if I were one of them.
Right.
I can't imagine how one wouldn't be paranoid.
And one interesting thing that I learned from your podcast is that it's not even clear if the highest ranking Iranian officials know the extent of the damage and the infiltration.
They don't know. And that's the part that I think really scares them. Right. And then they go and they start arresting people that have absolutely nothing to do with Israel. Like they just recently executed at the anniversary of Masa Amini, Babak Shahbazi, who was a political dissident accused of being a spy for Israel. But this is this is what they do. Kylie Gilbert Moore, who was a professor who was Australian, invited to Iran for some sort of seminar, was accused of being a spy for Israel. And that's one thing that she told me. She was also on my podcast too, that she learned that they really don't know who the infiltrators are. And as a result, they just want to show face. And so any kind of somebody who has any links to the West or any Westerner, et cetera, they'll just say, well, you're a spy for Israel.
For show.
For show.
Yeah.
Or maybe psychologically they're starting to believe it themselves too, potentially, right?
And also the other point in the podcast that was interesting is even just the damage to the nuclear sites and to the ballistic missile program. No one wants to be the bearer of bad news.
Yes.
In terms of, so there's just a lot in the dark for people making very important decisions.
Yes.
It seems like.
Yeah, they're dealing with a lot. I think they just recently had since the 12-day war, they've had 2 missile launches, and this recent one was unsuccessful as well. So they don't want to talk about it because it wasn't a success, right?
The Iranian president is obviously here in I think a lot of people's interpretation of his goal is to try to ease the situation and deter these sanctions from going into place. Do you think he's doing a good job?
I don't think so. No. His speech. I mean, one thing I mentioned in my reporting was that I actually had to take my earpiece out because I usually have a hard time hearing them from the 4th floor of the gallery for viewing. And he just seemed very angry. And, he could have used that as an opportunity for, an olive branch of some sort.
Right.
I didn't hear any of that. He didn't talk about Iran or any kind of domestic issues.
Yeah.
He was just very angry at the U.S. and Israel. And I think maybe he could have said that in a different way. That being said, some critics might say, well, his country was invaded and there was that 60-day deadline that Trump had invoked on Iran to come up to a nuclear deal. I believe that they were supposed to talk to Steve Witkoff, the envoy for the Middle East. I think it was day 63, and then Israel invaded day 61 or something like that. So from their perspective, they're going to say, well, we were doing things in good faith, and then you invaded. Or at least they can use that as an excuse now, nevertheless, right? Potentially.
And the opposite line would be, you were never negotiating in good faith.
Yeah, you were stalling.
And we came up on our 60-day mark, and that was the red line, and I stick by my red line, and here we are with the 12-day war.
Exactly. Or he says things like, well, you Americans pulled out of the JCPOA, so they've got things that they can say as excuses, but people can interpret it how they choose, right?
Yeah. The interesting element here is that prior to the 12-day war, Trump did seem like he wanted some new deal that was going to be better than Obama's deal. I mean, that's always his thing. We're going to get better NAFTA. We're going to
I still think he does.
No. Yeah, I think he's earnest in this and thinking that he can cultivate a new deal that's better, bigger and better. And this brings us into where I want to take the conversation, which is, will there ever be a deal again? This week, the Supreme Leader, obviously he's not in New York for UNGA, but while UNGA is going on, said negotiating with the United States under the current conditions carries harm for Iran, some of which are irreparable. This is not negotiation. This is dictation. I mean, he obviously did not mince words about his sentiment for the U.S. and does not seem eager to go back to the negotiation table. Others make the case that the only way to really put this issue to bed is a new deal. What do you make of his remarks and the potential for new negotiation and potentially a new deal?
He's always like this. I mean, even during the JCPOA years, he had the same kind of rhetoric. And he's supposed to be this like ideological figure of the so-called resistance, if you will. So you're always going to hear that kind of stuff for him. Ultimately, yes, he is the one in control and makes the decisions, but he does have to carry some sort of image to his base. And this falls in line with that. But at the end of the day, again, if the regime wants to survive, they're going to have to make some concessions. They're just not in a position. They're in a very weak position unless they want to invite more war. They're going to have to, again, concede in some form or fashion. But then today I heard from Ali Larijani, the chief security in Iran. He said something along the lines of, well, the U.S. is proposing that the missiles be part of this deal. And he was like, that's our red line. What do missiles have to do with the nuclear weapon? And then
by this, you mean the ballistic missile program?
Yes. And if you go back to the JCPOA, one of the criticisms was that it didn't include anything about that.
Let's take a beat on that because it is highly interesting. My understanding is during the 12-day war, 1/3 of the missiles—
That's correct, yeah.
were basically destroyed. And then on top of that, Israel targeted the missile launchers. So It wasn't just the missiles themselves, but the launchers. Now there seems to be this big rush to—
because it's part of their national security, if you will, for themselves. Because what else do they really have at this point?
What else do they really have? And on top of that, the war was informative in terms of how they can rebuild their missiles for a potential, further conflict.
And I think there's some talks they were thinking about engaging with China on some things with that. So again, we'll see if China's willing to help in that fashion, how far they'll go.
And my understanding is that Russia, who has been primarily the supply of weaponry into Iran, is now more hamstringed because of the war in Ukraine. And
they've got their own troubles.
They have their own troubles. China is a potential fail-safe, and they'll let Iran buy on credit.
If there's anyone who can help Iran right now, it's going to be China, if they can.
And this will be something to watch for.
But this would be something to watch for, and it depends on how China will then be perceived by Donald Trump, right? Are they willing to make that kind of sacrifice? And
their fragile relationships. I mean, China has a relationship with other GCC countries that are obviously adversarial to Iran, and China has a relationship with Israel. So,
well, they're a capitalist country, right? They'll just whatever works for them.
So we'll see what happens with the ballistic missile program. Taking us back to the deal itself, one guest on your show basically said, the U.S. attacks on Iran's nuclear sites forestalled its potential push towards a bomb, but a deal must be reached to guarantee it won't go nuclear. Do you agree with that?
I do agree that at some point you do have to have some sort of diplomatic solution. I don't think everything can be dealt with in a kinetic form. I mean, diplomacy is one avenue, and if that doesn't work, it's like, how do you deal with things? You've got sanctions, which is economic, which clearly is not working with Iran because they continue to possess the behavior that they have. Then you've got diplomacy, which is one option. Now, during the JCPOA, and this is according to American intelligence, Iran was complying under the deal at the 3.67 capped enriched uranium and whatnot. And they started to excel after Donald Trump actually pulled out. And which explains in some ways why we are where we are today. Right. And then the other option then is kinetic, but can everything be solved through military means, or can it be used as one form and then you go back to the negotiating table? And I think in this sense, that's probably what Trump was trying to do. And that's why he says, well, I stopped the war by dropping the bombs, or else I think Israel would have continued.
Some of the criticism, I think, to that line would have been they were compliant, but that there was potentially secret operation happening.
And there definitely was. Yes, we had Fordo.
And the cash injection via the sanctions relief was—
It wasn't, it definitely, I mean, according to a lot of the experts that I spoke with, it was imperfect.
Right.
But but at least it was verifiable in some form or fashion. At least you sort of knew what was going on, and they were eventually able to find out about those secret sites as well.
It seems like the alternative to a deal is this sort of mow the grass strategy. And basically what that tries to encapsulate is every few years or whatever the time frame is, there'll be some sort of military conflict that sets the nuclear program back, and then they rebuild, and then it sets it back, and it's basically mowing the grass back and forth. What do you think is more likely? It seems like that, from everything we know about the past few years of goodwill draining, that strategy seems a little bit more likely than renewal of a deal. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm curious what you think of what's likely.
I think especially, I mean, it depends who's going to be president next after this too, right? And what their foreign policy, but for the next, until Trump's term ends, I think most likely that might be the strategy going forward. But at the same time, Trump is somebody who wants to say he's a deal maker. I think he does want to shake the hand of Khamenei. That's why he wrote him letters.
Right.
So ultimately, it depends on not only what Trump wants to do, but what the Iranians are willing to do here too. But at the end of the day, talking about, secret sites and were they complying, were they not complying, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, as long as there is an Islamic Republic of Iran, there's always going to be that threat. Mm-hmm. This is just how it is. Until this regime is gone, it's going to be like this. Until you have some sort of semblance of a democratic regime that is an ally to the Western world, you are going to have these problems. So,
well, interestingly, during the 12-day war, people will debate if this was a true secondary goal or not.
Of regime change, you mean?
Of regime change.
I think it is I think Israel wants regime change. Every Israeli official I've spoken to is like, it's not about regime change. And I'm like, really?
Well, they did strike at Evin Prison. That's not a military target necessarily. They struck at the headquarters of Iran's state broadcaster, also not an explicit military target. So,
I mean, it appears that they might be holding maybe the next round for maybe more of the political echelons, right? Potentially.
Well, there's so many unintended consequences of regime change.
Yes.
And so I think it's something to be so careful when we talk about it, particularly in the West. But interestingly, obviously 3 months later, the regime is still in power. They seem, I wouldn't say stronger than ever, but as they have a grip on the population.
They're still there, yeah.
1,000 people have been executed this year. You
Terrible.
brought up Babak
Shahbazi.
Yes, thank you. He was accused, obviously, of spying for Israel. Activists say he was tortured into a false confession.
Most of them are, yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on how they've been able to cling to power in the past? Well, we could say in the past decades, but particularly post the 12-day war.
Well, first of all, I don't see any support for the Iranian people. Like recently, I was reading a story at the Washington Post that they were getting rid or freezing the VPNs in Iran so that they could bring in Starlink, but that hasn't actually happened. And that would also be very expensive and also inaccessible to a lot of people. There was, of course, the funding cuts to VOA and a lot of the amazing, Iranian American journalism and human rights organizations that, bring out all the human rights abuses and document it, which is very important, especially for future tribunals, et cetera, things like that, for the day that one day if the regime does fall. But the question is how you go about doing that. So a lot of Iranians, and 90 million people, everybody has a different opinion, but some people were saying, you know what, they didn't want bombs being dropped on their country. They feared for their own safety. When I think there was one tweet one day when Trump said, Tehran evacuated. There's like 18 million people in Tehran. How do you evacuate? And a lot of them were going up north. They were terrified, a lot of people.
And I think people saw the videos on Twitter of the 8-lane highways, everyone going in.
How are you going to rise up when there's military strikes above you? You just want to survive at that point, right? There's also other people who were quite disappointed. There were some people who, did welcome targeted strikes, but were disappointed that at the end it didn't really result in anything. And they were wondering, well, what was the point of that, right? There were about 1,000 innocent Iranians that were killed. There were innocent Iranians that were killed at the Evin prison strike because, striking the gates or the doors of Evin prison, I mean, the prisoners are behind the stalls. So how is that going to help anybody? You know what I mean? Cause some sort of revolution or something. It seemed, I thought that was a very unusual target. And it's also not, yes, I know that some people would say that the state television is, promoting propaganda, et cetera, terrorism, blah, blah, blah. And while that is true to a certain extent, it's also not a good precedent to strike at news facilities, because then who's to say where you draw the line? And if they view their journalists as terrorists, well, the Iranian government will view other Western journalists as terrorists. So, where do you draw the line there? So it doesn't necessarily set a good precedent. But at the end of the day, the regime, I think, is definitely weakened. As I said, the outcome showed that militarily, in terms of technology and intelligence, Israel is far superior. It did do a major blow or damage to them, but they're still standing. Again, I would think with extreme paranoia and probably causing some conflict or factions within them behind the scenes, one can assume naturally. But, it didn't cause people to rise up again because they were worried about their safety. Repression is at its highest, more than 1,000 executions this year alone. And when people say, oh, well, people eventually were too scared to rise up, I bring up examples of, well, during Women Life Freedom, there were security officers of the Iranian regime targeting protesters in the eye, and yet they were still out there. They were still protesting. There's always that kind of repression, right? So it begs the question, well, we have to ask ourselves, why didn't it happen, and take a deeper look? And also, while there is a distinction between the Iranian regime and the people, one thing that people don't talk about often is distinctions between Iranian people themselves.
Not a monolith.
Well, it's just like a whole different world in certain classes. Like, for example, on the eve of the 3rd year anniversary of Mahsa Amini, there was a pop concert of a very famous singer named Sirvan Khosravi, who's actually of Kurdish origin, like Mahsa Amini. And it was held at Niyavarun Palace, which is the old grounds of the Shah in the previous regime. And people were, I'll show you the footage after, like women were dressed like you and me, wearing what they appear to be wanting to wear, hijabless, and dancing to pop music. And but you have to ask yourselves, and this is something I spoke about actually in one of my recent podcasts with a Iranian singer from the band Kiosk. And he goes, well, was it held in a public square for free where people could go? No, because then that way they can't control people. Then there would have been some sort of uprising if you allowed like a big crowd. So it was in a kind of closed area. I would assume the upper echelons of society. Right now, there's a water shortage in Iran. There are dry taps. People can't afford to eat. It's a struggle. So who's going to afford to go to a concert? I can imagine people within, I'm not going to say they're all the regime's children or something, but at least people who are connected to that apparatus, right, in some form or fashion. So who are these people going? And at the end of the day, if they're having fun and they're dancing, they say to themselves, well, I have a semblance of a normal life. Why would I go and risk my life?
Right. Especially when the consequence is so extreme.
The consequences are so extreme. And if they have some sort of semblance of a normal life, and if they're content in that fashion, why would they go out and do something, right? So there's a big disparity between the different classes in Iran and the kind of lifestyle. Like, if I show you some footage of Tehran right now, you're going to see Maseratis and again, people dressed like you and me listening to the,
Well, what's so interesting is
music and
raves. You go on TikTok, and there's been this uptick of Instagram influencers traveling to Iran.
Yes. A lot of Russians, I've noticed, and Chinese.
Russians, Chinese, but also, like, I was watching a video of a woman who's Irish, and
I saw that one, I was very surprised.
It's surprising. I mean, it's surprising for an American audience, and you have to wonder, it's like, is it cultivated in a way where they're like, oh, it's not as bad as you think, but really it is, because you're getting just a sliver of what the TikTok algorithm has given to you, which is
you're getting a sliver of this upper echelons of society. They get to do whatever they want. And I did this 1-year documentary at my old job at Global News about Iranian regime interference in Canada. And guess what? Like, a lot of the regime officials, their children, they're all in Canada, and they all have their second homes, third homes, going back and forth. They can have fun. It's fine. They can do what they want to do. No problem.
One thing I've also heard is that the regime is going to fall in 5 to 10 years, and why have a military intervention or even potential regime change? Like, it's going to happen already. Do you think that's Pollyannish, or do you think that's directionally correct?
I think how long, it's been 46 years? Something like that, since 1979. How long can you rule with repression?
Right.
And with the country being so weakened and economically unstable, people trying to, there's this huge brain drain, right? Like all of the top doctors in North America, a lot of them are from Iran, right? But they're not contributing. I'm not contributing to, my family's homeland in any way. I'm contributing in North America. So, with people just end up leaving, how can this stay? How can this function? I agree that I don't think it can last forever. I really don't think that any repressive regime can last that long. But I mean, it's hard to say, right? I can't look in a crystal ball, but definitely you're seeing an evolution in society. Right. Now, that doesn't mean that the regime is less repressive. They are more repressive than they've ever been. But they can't keep up with the advancements of Iranian people themselves. And the next generation. Like even you'll see a lot of families where the mother or the grandmother might wear a hijab or be more conservative, and then their daughters are not like that at all.
Right.
So when you see that with the regime officials and their children, most of them are not ideological anymore. So when one generation dies off and the next generation comes, what would that be like? In many ways, people argue that we already are in a post-Khamenei, post-Islamic society, because Iran is it's not in the Islamic Republic of Iran. It really is nothing Islamic about that country anymore at all. But it definitely is more of kind of a controlled military state, right? A police state.
Well, what's interesting too is because it is a theocracy.
In theory, yeah.
In theory, but when you use...
And their laws, too.
When you use religion as a mechanism for punishment and repression, sometimes, and I think this is, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, in the Iranian case, people become less religious.
Yes, 100%.
And
I
this
think
seems
if
to be
anything...
what's played out.
Yeah, Khomeini, I think, if you talk to people who were there at the start of the revolution, or you read books, there were a lot of people who really were rallying behind him and are ideological, for his death, and they're going to his gravesite, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's going to Khomeini's gravesite on his anniversary anymore and praying for him. Okay, maybe a small, maybe 5%, I don't know. But majority of people don't believe in that anymore. And even inside Iran, they're unofficially selling alcohol at some restaurants. And people are just not wearing their hijab. Again, that doesn't mean that it's not a repressive country. It is, as you can see. But it's not an Islamic society in the way that people think it is, with their black cloaks, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Well, to bring it back to where we started, you're here for UNGA. The Iranian president has spoken, Donald Trump has spoken, the supreme leader has spoken from Iran. Obviously, he's not here. What can we expect with regard to the tension and the relationship in the coming weeks and months?
I think we're inching closer towards war. It's a question that I always ask my analysts or my guests, and most people actually say no, especially when I talk to officials. But I really feel like that is what we're moving towards because of this lack of cooperation from the Iranian side. And again, are they on a suicide mission? Do they want to keep the regime alive? But it might get to that phase of war potentially if diplomacy doesn't work out in this case. But one thing I've noticed that I've been here all week is that a lot of officials are too terrified to talk about Iran. I went after Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. First time I asked him about if there's even hope for diplomacy. Of course, he's one of the E3 members. And with regards to the snapback mechanism. And first, he didn't answer me. Second time, he asked me how I was doing because he didn't want to answer me. But at least he was polite and shook my hand.
Why do you think he's too scared?
Nobody wants to overstep President Trump right now.
Okay.
If you even analyze all the speeches this week, Zelensky, Al-Shara, all of them basically are speaking to Trump. They're not speaking to a global audience. They're speaking to this one man who's the president of the United States. I saw it with the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. I saw him today at Press Island when he was doing an interview for Fox. At first, they were, I politely asked if we could just get a quick clip when he was coming out, and his team was ready to do that. And then they're like, oh, so what's the topic? And I'm like, Iran. They're like, oh, we're very busy. And nobody wanted to talk about it because nobody wants to overstep Donald Trump and in some ways maybe rub him the wrong way.
Well, we'll see. Hopefully that can be overcome. Negar Mojtahedi, thank you so much for being here. This was really enlightening conversation for me, and I hope for our listeners too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun. Thank you, Rafaela.